All right, fine. So today we are going to study to be forms past. This is the lesson number 5 and in of general English grammar course. And in this grammar course, we are going to study very important sentences formations which are used in spoken English. तो स्पोकन इंग्लिश में यूज किए जाने वाले जो जनरल सेंटेंसेस है, उन जनरल सेंटेंसेस को बनाने के लिए सबसे इम्पोर्टेंट हमें क्या लगता है, वो है ग्रामर. और उस ग्रामर के हिसाब से हम आज जनरल इंग्लिश ग्रामर कोर्स का लेसन नंबर 5 पढ़ रहे हैं. ओके, तो इसमें हम क्या पढ़ने वाले हैं? टू बी फॉर्म्स में पास्ट टू बी फॉर्म्स पढ़ने वाले हैं. पहले हमने टू बी फॉर्म्स प्रेजेंट पढ़ा, तो उसमें हमने क्या यूज किया? एम आर इज. अब क्या यूज करेंगे? वॉज, वेयर, वॉज. बस 3 चीजें हमने पिछले लेसन में पढ़ी. हाउ टू यूज एम आर इज विद द सब्जेक्ट्स. एंड नाउ वी आर गोइंग टू स्टडी हाउ टू यूज वॉज, वेयर विद द सब्जेक्ट्स. तो मैं आपको एक बहुत अच्छी टिप दे रहा हूं. वो टिप यदि आप उसको यदि फॉलो करोगे तो आपको 2 मिनट में ये अंग्रेजी बोलना या ये टू बी फॉर्म्स पास्ट समझना सरल हो जाएगा. तो क्या टिप्स है? एम आर इज की जगह पर आपको क्या करना है? एम की जगह पर वॉज यूज करना है, आर की जगह पर वर यूज करना है और इज की जगह पर वॉज यूज करना है. बस इस लेसन में हम नया कुछ भी नहीं पढ़ रहे हैं. जहां जहां आपको एम दिखता है वहां पर आपको वॉज लगाना है तो पास्ट हो जाएगा. जहां जहां आपको आर दिखता है वहां पर वर लगाना है तो आपका पास्ट हो जाएगा. और जहां जहां आपको इज दिखता है वहां वॉज लगाना है तो आपका पास्ट हो जाएगा. ओके, तो आपको करना क्या है? सिर्फ और सिर्फ ये 3 रिप्लेसमेंट करने हैं. एम की जगह पर वॉज, मैं हूं की जगह पर मैं था, वह है की जगह पर वह था, और तुम हो की जगह पर तुम थे. मतलब है की जगह पर था, थी, थे लगाना है. तो एम की जगह पर वॉज, आर की जगह पर वर और इज की जगह पर वॉज लगाना है. मेरे पीछे बोलिए तो थोड़ा सा मीनिंग भी अंडरस्टैंड कीजिए. मैं आपको मीनिंग बताता हूँ, थोड़ा सा सिर्फ सुनिए अच्छी तरह से. आई वॉज अ डॉक्टर, मतलब आई वॉज अ डॉक्टर मतलब क्या? मैं डॉक्टर था. वी वर डॉक्टर्स, हम डॉक्टर्स थे. अनेक वचन आ गया है इसमें. यू वर अ डॉक्टर, आप एक डॉक्टर थे. यू वेर डॉक्टर्स, आप सभी डॉक्टर्स थे. दे वर डॉक्टर्स, वे सभी डॉक्टर्स थे. राम एंड श्याम वर डॉक्टर्स, राम और श्याम डॉक्टर्स थे. दीज वर डॉक्टर्स, ये डॉक्टर्स थे. दोज वर डॉक्टर्स, वे डॉक्टर्स थे. ही वॉज अ डॉक्टर, वह डॉक्टर था. शी वॉज अ डॉक्टर, वह डॉक्टर थी. और राम वॉज अ डॉक्टर, राम डॉक्टर था. मेरे ख्याल से अभी एक आपको बताता हूं ताकि आपका अंडरस्टैंडिंग बढ़ जाएगा. आई वॉज अ शॉपकीपर 3 years ago, मैं 3 साल पहले एक दुकानदार था. वी वर शॉपकीपर्स 3 years ago, हम सब 3 साल के पहले दुकानदार थे. यू वर अ शॉपकीपर 3 years ago, आप 3 साल पहले दुकानदार थे. यू वर शॉपकीपर्स 3 years ago, आप सभी 3 साल के पहले दुकानदार थे. दे वर शॉपकीपर्स 3 years ago, वे सभी 3 साल पहले दुकानदार थे. राम एंड श्याम वर शॉपकीपर्स 3 years ago, राम और श्याम 3 साल के पहले शॉपकीपर्स थे, दुकानदार थे. दीज वेर शॉपकीपर्स 3 years ago, वे सभी 3 साल के पहले दुकानदार थे. दोज वर शॉपकीपर्स 3 years ago, वे सभी 3 साल पहले दुकानदार थे. ही वॉज अ शॉपकीपर 3 years ago, वह 3 साल के पहले दुकानदार था. शी वॉज अ शॉपकीपर 3 years ago, वह 3 साल पहले दुकानदार थी. और राम वॉज अ शॉपकीपर 3 years ago, राम 3 साल के पहले दुकानदार था. मेरे ख्याल से आपको अभी ये समझ में आ गया है. मेरे पीछे बोलिए तो थोड़ा सा आपका लिप्स मूवमेंट का प्रैक्टिस हो जाएगा. ऑलराइट, बोलिए मेरे पीछे. आई वॉज अ प्लेयर ऑफ दैट टीम.
I was a player that of team.
वी वर प्लेयर्स.
We were players.
यू वर अ प्लेयर.
You were a player.
यू वेर प्लेयर्स.
You were players.
दे वेर प्लेयर्स.
They were players.
राम एंड श्याम वर प्लेयर्स.
Ram and Sham were players.
These were players.
These were players.
Those were players.
Those were players.
He was a player.
He was a player.
She was a player.
She was a player.
Ram was a player.
Ram was a player.
Very good. अभी और एक प्रैक्टिस करते हैं. I was a teacher.
I was a teacher.
We were teachers.
We were teachers.
You were a teacher.
You were a teacher.
You were teachers.
You were teachers.
They were teachers.
They were teachers.
Ram and Sham were teachers.
Ram and Sham were teachers.
These were teachers.
These were teachers.
Those were teachers.
Those were teachers.
He was a teacher.
He was a teacher.
She was a teacher.
She was a teacher.
Ram was a teacher.
Ram was a teacher.
Okay, अभी आपको sentences बनाना है. I was a minister. बोलिए.
I was a minister. We were ministers. You were a minister. You were ministers. They were ministers. Ram and Sham were ministers. These were ministers. Those were ministers. He was a minister. She was a minister. Ram was a minister.
Very good. अब बोलिए. I was an accountant. एक क्वेश्चन में and लगाना है, अनेक क्वेश्चन में and लगाना नहीं है. I was an accountant. बोलिए.
I was an accountant. We were accountants. You were an accountant. You were accountants. They were accountants. Ram and Sham were accountants. These were accountants. Those were accountants. He was an accountant. She was an accountant. Ram was an accountant.
आज की ट्रेन स्पीड से चल रही है जी, क्योंकि समझ में आ गया आपको. बोलिए. I was an engineer.
I was an engineer. We were engineers. You were an engineer. You were engineers. They were engineers. Ram and Sham were engineers. These were engineers. Those were engineers. He was an engineer. She was an engineer. Ram was an engineer.
Very good. Very good. I was a player. बोलिए.
I was a player. We were a player. You were a player. You were players. They were players. Ram and Sham were players. These were a player. Those were a player. He was a player. She was a player. Ram was a player.
बहुत अच्छा, बहुत अच्छा. अभी निगेटिव सेंटेंस में सिर्फ नॉट लगाना है. इधर हमने क्या, सेकंड कॉलम देखिए. सेकंड कॉलम में हम निगेटिव सेंटेंसेस पढ़ रहे हैं. तो इसमें हमने क्या किया है, wasn't और weren't और wasn't. तो बोलने में was not का प्रयोग ज्यादा होता है, were not का प्रयोग ज्यादा होता है और was not का प्रयोग ज्यादा होता है. इसलिए आपको यहाँ पर was not, were not का प्रयोग करना है. मेरे पीछे बोलिए. I was not a doctor.
I was not a doctor.
मैं डॉक्टर नहीं था.
मैं डॉक्टर नहीं था.
We were not doctors.
We were not doctor.
हम डॉक्टर्स नहीं थे.
हम डॉक्टर्स नहीं थे.
You were not a doctor.
You were not a doctor.
आप एक डॉक्टर नहीं थे.
आप एक डॉक्टर नहीं थे.
You were not doctors.
You were not doctors.
आप सभी डॉक्टर्स नहीं थे.
आप सभी डॉक्टर्स नहीं थे.
They were not doctors.
They were not doctors.
वे सभी डॉक्टर्स नहीं थे.
They सभी डॉक्टर नहीं थे.
Ram and Sham were not doctors.
Ram and Sham were not doctor.
Ram and Sham डॉक्टर्स नहीं थे.
Ram and Sham डॉक्टर नहीं थे.
These were not doctors.
These were not doctors.
ये डॉक्टर्स नहीं थे.
यह डॉक्टर नहीं थे.
Those were not doctors.
Those were not doctors.
वे डॉक्टर्स नहीं थे.
वे डॉक्टर्स नहीं थे.
He was not a doctor.
He was not a doctor.
वह डॉक्टर नहीं था.
वह डॉक्टर नहीं था.
She was not a doctor.
She was not a doctor.
वह डॉक्टर नहीं थी.
वह डॉक्टर नहीं थी.
Ram was not a doctor.
Ram was not a doctor.
राम डॉक्टर नहीं था.
राम डॉक्टर नहीं था.
वेरी गुड, बहुत अच्छा. अभी मेरे पीछे थोड़े से सेंटेंसेस बोलिए ताकि आपको समझ में भी आ जाएगा और बोलने में भी सरलता होगी. I was not a teacher.
I was not a teacher.
We were not teachers.
We were not teachers.
You were not a teacher.
You were not a teacher.
You were not teachers.
You were not teachers.
They were not teachers.
They were not teachers.
Ram and Sham were not teachers.
Ram and Sham were not teachers.
These were not teachers.
These were not teachers.
Those were not teachers.
Those were not teachers.
He was not a teacher.
He was not a teacher.
She was not a teacher.
She was not a teacher.
Ram was not a teacher.
Ram was not a teacher.
I was not an athlete.
I was not an athlete.
We were not athletes.
We were not athletes.
You were not an athlete.
You were not athletes.
You were not athletes.
You were not athletes.
They were not athletes.
They were not athletes.
Ram and Shyam were not athletes.
Ram and Shyam were not athletes.
These were not athletes.
These were not athletes.
Those were not athletes.
Those were not athletes.
He was not an athlete.
He was not athlete.
She was not an athlete.
She was not athlete.
Ram was not an athlete.
Ram was not athlete.
Very good. बहुत अच्छा. अब आप sentences बनाइए. I was not a player.
I was not a player. We were not a player. You were not a player. We were not a player. They were not a players. Ram and
आ रहा है थोड़ा सा बोलने में. They were not players. ऐसा बोलना है.
They were not players. Ram and Shyam were not players. These were not players. Those were not players. He was not a player. She was not a player. Ram was not a player.
Okay. I was not an officer.
I was not an officer. We were not officers. You were not an officer. You were not officers. They were not officers. Ram and Shyam were not officers. These were not officers. Those were not officers. He was not an officer. She was not an officer. Ram was not an officer.
Very good. बहुत अच्छा. I was not a bank manager. बोलिए.
I was not a bank manager. We were not a bank manager. You were not a bank manager. You were not bank managers. They were not bank managers. Ram and Shyam were not bank managers. These were not bank managers. Those were not bank managers. He was not a bank manager. She was not a bank manager. Ram was not a bank manager.
Very good. बहुत अच्छा. Okay. अभी questions बनाते हैं. Questions में was और were और was ये subjects के पहले आएंगे. मेरे पीछे बोलिए. Was I a player?
Was I a player?
Okay. मैं हिंदी मीनिंग बताता हूँ. आप सुनिए आराम से. Was I a player? क्या मैं player था? Were we players? क्या हम players थे? Were you a player? क्या आप player थे? Were you players? क्या आप सभी players थे? Were they players? क्या वे सभी players थे? Were Ram and Shyam players? क्या राम और श्याम players थे? Were these players? क्या ये सभी players थे? Were those players? क्या वे सभी players थे? Was he a player? क्या वह player था? Was she a player? क्या वह player थी? Was Ram a player? क्या राम player था? देखो अभी आपको प्रश्न पूछना है, मैं जवाब दूंगा. ओके अभी एक बार सिर्फ मेरे पीछे बोलिए, अंडरस्टैंड कीजिए क्वेश्चन कैसे बोला जाता है, और उसके बाद क्वेश्चन आप पूछना है, आंसर मैं दूंगा, उसके बाद मैं आपको क्वेश्चन पूछूंगा, आपको आंसर देना है. ओके मेरे पीछे बोलिए. Was I a player?
Was I a player?
Were we players?
Were we players?
Were you a player?
Were you a player?
Were you players?
Were you players?
Were they players?
Were they players?
Were Ram and Shyam players?
Were Ram and Shyam players?
Was he a player?
Was he a player?
Was she a player?
Was she a player?
Was Ram a player?
Was Ram a player?
Okay, अब आपको प्रश्न पूछा है, पूछिए मुझे. Was I a lecturer? पूछिए.
Was I a lecturer?
Yes, you were a lecturer. No, you were not a lecturer. ध्यान में आया आंसर कैसे देना है? ओके नेक्स्ट.
was की जगह पे were लगाना है क्या आंसर
नहीं
देते
नहीं
टाइम पे?
देखो was I a lecturer का आंसर you में आएगा ना, तो you के साथ तो were आता है.
ओके ओके हाँ.
और एक बार पूछिए तो समझ में आएगा. हाँ.
Was I a lecturer?
Yes, you were a lecturer. No, you were not a lecturer. Next question.
Were we lecturers?
Lecturers. Yes, we were lecturers. No, we were not lecturers.
Were you a lecturer?
Yes, I was a lecturer. No, I was not a lecturer.
Were you lecturers?
Yes, we were lecturers. No, we were not lecturers.
Were they lecturers?
Yes, they were lecturers. No, they were not lecturers.
Were Ram and Shyam lecturers?
Yes, Ram and Shyam were lecturers. No, Ram and Shyam were not lecturers.
Were these lecturers?
Yes, these were lecturers. No, these were not lecturers.
Were those boys lecturers?
Yes, those boys were lecturers. No, those boys were not lecturers.
Was he lecturer?
Yes, he was a lecturer. No, he was not a lecturer.
Was she lecturer?
Yes, she was a lecturer. No, she was not a lecturer.
Ram was lecturer?
Was Ram a lecturer?
Was Ram lecturer?
Yes, Ram was a lecturer. No, Ram was not a lecturer. और एक बार पूछो, Was I a bookkeeper? पूछिए।
Was I
तो
a
अभी
book?
आपको आंसर की तरफ भी ध्यान देना है, क्योंकि दूसरे राउंड में आपको आंसर देना है। ओके,
Was I a bookkeeper?
यस, यू वर अ बुककीपर, नो यू वर नॉट अ बुककीपर।
Were we bookkeeper?
ओके, थर्ड कॉलम में आप हमें प्रश्न पूछ रहे हैं आप। ओके, हाँ पूछिए, वर वी बुककीपर्स?
Were we bookkeeper?
यस, वी वर बुककीपर्स, नो वी वर नॉट बुककीपर्स।
Were you bookkeeper?
यस, आई वाज अ बुककीपर, नो आई वाज नॉट अ बुककीपर।
Were you bookkeeper?
यस, वी वर बुककीपर्स, नो वी वर नॉट बुककीपर्स।
Were they bookkeepers?
Yes, they were bookkeepers. No, they were not bookkeepers.
Were Ram and Sham bookkeepers?
Yes, Ram and Sham were bookkeepers. No, Ram and Sham were not bookkeepers.
Were these bookkeepers?
Yes, these were bookkeepers. No, these were not bookkeepers.
Were those bookkeepers?
Yes, those were bookkeepers. No, those were not bookkeepers.
Was he bookkeeper?
Yes, he was a bookkeeper. No, he was not a bookkeeper.
Was she bookkeeper?
Yes, she was a bookkeeper. No, she was not a bookkeeper.
Was Ram bookkeeper?
Yes, Ram was a bookkeeper. No, Ram was not a bookkeeper. Very good. बहुत अच्छा। अभी आपको प्रश्न के जवाब देने हैं। Okay, was I a librarian?
You were a yes. You were a librarian.
No.
No. You were not a librarian.
Very good. Were we librarians?
Yes. We were librarian. No, we were not librarian.
Were you a librarian?
Yes, yes, I am. I was
was.
library. I was librarian. No, I was not librarian.
Were you librarians?
Yes, we were
were.
We were librarians. No, we were not librarians.
Were they librarians?
Yes, they were librarians. No, they are not librarians.
Were Ram and Sham librarians?
Yes, Ram and Sham were librarians. No, Ram and Sham were not librarians.
Were these librarians?
Yes, these were librarians. No, these were not librarians.
Were those librarians?
Yes, those were librarians. No, those were not librarians.
Was he a librarian?
Yes, he was librarian. No, he was not librarian.
Was she a librarian?
Yes, she was librarian. No, she was not librarian.
Was Ram a librarian?
Yes, Ram was librarian. No, Ram was not librarian.
Very good. बहुत अच्छा अर्चना जी, बहुत अच्छा। अभी और एक बार प्रश्न पूछता हूँ। Was I a professor?
We were.
Yes,
sorry.
you.
Yes, you were a professor. No, you were not professor.
Were we professors?
Yes, we were professors. No, we were not professors.
Were you a professor?
Yes, I was a professor. No, I was not a professor.
Were you professors?
Yes, I was a.
We were.
You were a professor. We were a professor. No, we were not a professor.
Were Ram and Sham professors?
Yes, Ram and Sham were professors. No, Ram and Sham were not professors.
Were they professors?
Yes, they were professors. No, they were not professors.
Were these professors?
Yes, these were professors. No, these were not professors.
Were those professors?
Yes, those were professors. No, those were not professors.
Was he a professor?
Yes, he was a professor. No, he was not a professor.
Was she a professor?
Yes, she was a professor. No, she was not a professor.
Was Ram a professor?
Yes, Ram was a professor. No, Ram was not a professor.
बहुत अच्छा जी, बहुत अच्छा। अभी wasn't I, ये निगेटिव क्वेश्चन है। wasn't I, weren't we, weren't you, ये सब कॉन्ट्रैक्शंस यूज करके हम निगेटिव क्वेश्चंस बना रहे हैं। मेरे पीछे मैं आपको थोड़ा सा हिंदी मीनिंग बता रहा हूँ, थोड़ा सा ध्यान से सुनना है। ओके, wasn't I a tailor, क्या मैं टेलर नहीं था? weren't we tailors, क्या हम टेलर नहीं थे? weren't you a tailor, क्या आप टेलर नहीं थे? weren't you tailors, क्या आप टेलर्स नहीं थे? weren't they tailors, क्या वे टेलर्स नहीं थे? weren't Ram and Sham tailors, क्या राम और श्याम टेलर्स नहीं थे? weren't these tailors, क्या ये टेलर्स नहीं थे? weren't those tailors, क्या वे टेलर्स नहीं थे? wasn't he a tailor, क्या यह टेलर नहीं था? wasn't she a tailor, क्या वह टेलर नहीं थी? wasn't Ram a tailor, क्या राम टेलर नहीं था? ओके, अभी आपको प्रश्न पूछना है, मैं आपको जवाब दूंगा। ओके, और एक बार मेरे पीछे बोलिए, थोड़ा सा अंडरस्टैंड कीजिए। wasn't I an examiner, मेरे पीछे बोलिए, wasn't I an examiner?
Wasn't I examiners?
Okay, weren't we examiners?
Weren't we examiners?
Weren't you an examiner?
Weren't you an examiner?
Weren't you examiners?
Weren't you examiners?
Weren't they examiners?
Weren't they examiners?
Weren't Ram and Sham examiners?
Weren't Ram and Sham examiners?
Weren't these examiners?
Weren't these examiners?
Weren't those examiners?
Weren't those examiners?
Wasn't he an examiner?
Wasn't he an examiner?
Wasn't she an examiner?
Wasn't she an examiner?
Wasn't Ram an examiner?
Wasn't Ram an examiner? Ram examiner.
वेरी गुड, बहुत अच्छा. ओके, अभी और एक बार आपको प्रश्न पूछना है, मैं आपको जवाब दूंगा. पूछिए मुझे. Wasn't I a mechanic? पूछिए.
Wasn't I a mechanic?
Yes, you weren't a mechanic. No, you were a mechanic.
Weren't we mechanic?
Okay, लास्ट वाला कॉलम पढ़ रहे हैं हम. हाँ, पूछिए. Weren't we mechanics?
Weren't we mechanic?
Yes, we weren't mechanics. No, we were mechanics.
Weren't you mechanic?
Yes, I wasn't a mechanic. No, I was a mechanic.
Weren't you mechanic?
Yes, we weren't mechanics. No, we weren't. We were mechanics.
Weren't they mechanics?
Yes, they weren't mechanics. No, they were mechanics.
Weren't Ram and Sham mechanics?
Yes, Ram and Sham weren't mechanics. No, Ram and Sham were mechanics.
Weren't these mechanics?
Yes, these weren't mechanics. No, these were mechanics.
Weren't those mechanics?
Yes, those weren't mechanics. No, those were mechanics.
Wasn't he mechanic?
Yes, he wasn't a mechanic. No, he was a mechanic.
Wasn't she mechanic?
Yes, she wasn't a mechanic. No, she was a mechanic.
Wasn't Ram mechanic?
Yes, Ram wasn't a mechanic. No, Ram was a mechanic. Very good. Okay, अभी पूछना है आपको. Wasn't I an umpire?
Wasn't I an umpire?
Yes, you weren't an umpire. No, you were an umpire.
Okay. Weren't we umpires?
Yes, we weren't umpires. No, we were umpires.
Weren't you umpire?
Yes, I wasn't an umpire. No, I was an umpire.
Weren't you umpires?
Yes, we weren't umpires. No, we were umpires.
They were, weren't they umpires?
Yes, they weren't umpires. No, they were umpires.
Weren't Ram and Sham umpires?
Yes, Ram and Sham weren't umpires. No, Ram and Sham were umpires.
Weren't these umpires?
Yes, these weren't umpires. No, these were umpires.
Weren't those umpires?
Yes, those weren't umpires. No, those were umpires.
Wasn't he umpire?
Yes, he wasn't an umpire. No, he was an umpire.
Wasn't she an umpire?
Yes, she wasn't an umpire. No, she was an umpire.
Wasn't Ram an umpire?
Yes, Ram wasn't an umpire. No, Ram was an umpire. Okay. अभी इसको आपको पूरा स्टडी करना है, इसके सेंटेंसेस बनाना है और इधर फिल इन द ब्लैंक्स में इन सभी सेंटेंसेस को आपको अपने नोटबुक्स में लिखना है. अभी कल हम नॉन लिविंग थिंग्स में किस प्रकार से हम was और were का प्रयोग करना है और इस पूरे सेंटेंसेस में किस प्रकार से हिंदी और अंग्रेजी वाक्य बन सकते हैं उसकी चर्चा हम कल के नेक्स्ट लेसन में करने वाले हैं. ओके, आर यू एंजॉयिंग?
Yes, sir.
Are you cheerful?
Yes, sir.
Are you excited?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so it was very good lesson today and we had a great
Yes, sir.
fun.
25.
All right, bye bye. See you again.
Thank you, sir. Bye bye.